So, I've reached the end of week one. Welcome to Psychology Masters. Today I'm just going to be touching briefly on some of the different things that I learned across all my modules this week. I had modules in social psychology, I had biopsychology, cognition, the psychology of health and difficulties and disorders, as well as psychological research methods, and I think that was pretty much it. So I'm going to be giving links to the biographies of my different lecturers in the description. So it's from these people that I'm giving you the second-hand information. So it's really worthwhile checking out these lecturers. They're brilliant, brilliant people. And I nearly forgot, I also have lifespan and development as well. But that's not because it's uninteresting. It's because you may notice in my voice I'm suffering with a bit of a cold and flu at the moment, so I'm probably going to keep this video a little bit short because my cognitive abilities are not as good as they could be. But most importantly, here I am, and I'm going to discuss some really interesting psychology with you. So, looking at the biopsychology module first, we discussed a whole cohort of things, but I'm just going to touch on some of the more interesting bits that were particularly of interest to me, and I hope they're interesting to you too. So, we looked at something called sequence recall, which is something I had never heard of before. Sequence recall is a subconscious bias of sorts that can irritate us greatly, and you're likely familiar with this yourself. I've experienced it an awful lot in my life. I'm going to give you a kind of a funny example of a sequence recall this week that I've had, and that's with Shakira's Wherever song. I cannot get that song out of my head, despite the fact that I don't like it. And it's because humans have this tendency to recall certain sequences, and it's the chorus that's in my head. Wherever, we're meant to be together. And it's that sequence that is just repeating in my head. That melody has a specific sequence which I have a subconscious selective bias for, and that's called sequence recall. Any of the phenomena that I'm going to discuss today, I encourage you to research yourself and learn more about, depending on which things you find more or less interesting. We also looked at a syndrome called Korsakoff syndrome. I had forgotten about it. I had read about it in Oliver Sacks' The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which is a fantastic book and I recommend you read it. But Korsakoff syndrome is something that's seen in a lot of alcoholics, and researchers wondered, has it got to do with their alcoholism, or maybe is it something else? It was understood to be an alcoholic disorder for a long time. As time progressed and as the research developed, it was realised that it's actually not the alcoholism that causes it. It's something that often goes hand in hand with alcoholism, which is poor diet. So let me give you just a little brief insight into Korsakoff syndrome. It presents with dementia-like symptoms, so loss of memory, impaired cognition, and a lot of the different symptoms you'd see in Alzheimer's, for instance, will be present in Korsakoff syndrome. Because typically alcoholics have a poor diet, they're not getting enough vitamin B, which is essential for proper brain function. And when you're not getting vitamin B, you can present with dementia-like symptoms. Some people colloquially refer to this in alcoholics as wet brain, but it's likely a form of Korsakoff syndrome. So it's important for people to be having a good diet, and it's unfortunate that with alcoholism we also see, as well as an addiction to the drug, a poor diet as well, which can have other effects other than the effects that alcohol have in the body and the brain. We also touched on critical periods, which I found very interesting. So I was familiar with critical periods when it came to animals. So an example of a critical period in animals would be for birds. There is a very specific period of time which some species of bird can learn birdsong, and if they're deprived of learning birdsong in that critical period, they'll never learn it correctly, and it's unlikely that they'll be sexually successful in the future or reproductively successful. So, for instance, the birdsong just won't sound right. So I knew that, and I thought that was interesting, and there's some different research on things like imprinting, which is very interesting, and that's also relevant to critical periods. What I hadn't realised was critical periods in human psychological development. We discussed the case of a girl called Jeannie, who was terribly neglected. It's one of the most horrific instances of child abuse you can imagine. This girl was tied to a chair for most of her life. She wasn't fed proper food. She was attacked and shouted at by her family. She was living a real hell, and she wasn't discovered up until she was 12 years old. And at this time she had no real language and no real normal cognitive level of your typical 12-year-old. The study of Jeannie helped us realize that there are actually critical periods in humans for language development. So although there was intense rehab for Jeannie in terms of therapy, in terms of education, she could never reach language development higher than that of a 5-year-old, which is terrible to think, but it just goes to show the importance of early education and early development in terms of our future lifespan. So that was biopsychology. I'm going to move on very quickly to social psychology, and that is incredibly interesting, especially to me, who's very interested in forthcomingness and the relationships we have with people. So I'm going to touch on some of the really interesting things that came up in that class. So first of all, you might be familiar with this. I know I was. The bystander effect. And the bystander effect is that idea which describes how we act when we're in a crowd. Some kind of famous examples or televised examples you might be familiar with is, let's say you're in a waiting room of a doctor's office, and the room is full of people, and you see smoke billowing out from underneath one of the doors, but nobody else is acting. Nobody else is reacting to the smoke from billowing under the door. And you can see that the experimental individual, so the individual who doesn't know anything about this, kind of looks around and they want to act, and you can see that in their body language, but there's something holding them back. And that's what's typically referred to as the bystander effect. So you will come across it in your everyday life. Maybe you'll be at a concert and somebody will fall down and nobody will seem to pass any remarks or pay any attention. But an interesting thing which I hadn't learned before that class was that there is a way to combat the bystander effect, a very effective way to combat it. And that's if you identify roles for the different people around you. So let's say, taking that example of somebody in a concert who's fallen down and might be getting trampled and they're not getting the attention they need. Well, if you, as the coordinator in that situation, you recognize that something bad is happening, you say, okay, you need to call the ambulance. You need to try and make a pathway outside of this crowd. You need to support that person's head, and I'm going to try and lift them up. So if you identify roles for different people, that can compel people to act, which I thought was very interesting. And kind of related to that, which I found fascinating, was something that affects our cognition, something that affects our behaviour, called the imagined presence of people. So it's not only the actual presence of people around you that affects your behaviour, but it's the imagined presence as well. So for instance, it makes perfect sense when you describe it, but it was just a little bit counterintuitive to me in the beginning. Imagine you're about to make a presentation. You're in solitude, you're by yourself, no one else around. You're thinking about what you're going to discuss in front of this big crowd, and you start to sweat and the hairs start to stand up. It's called piloerection, as an aside. And you start to worry and you start to pace. But there's nobody around you in that moment. There's nobody around you. It's the imagined presence of people in front of you when you get out on that stage or when you walk up to the front of that classroom. That's what's affecting your behaviour. So it's not only the actual presence, but it's the imagined presence of people that can affect your physiology and affect your behaviour. Another thing we touched on in social psychology is a reason that it's been getting a lot of flack recently. And this reason I'm going to tell you about is called the replication crisis. So there have been a lot of seminal studies in social psychology over the last 100 years. Seminal meaning just incredibly important. And up until recently, they were accepted as gospel. Now, it seems that a lot of their findings cannot be replicated. And this is happening across all of social psychology and even in a lot of other sciences. And it's making us reevaluate and try and work from the ground up as to, well, what is true and what isn't true, because there's so much stuff that we've been referencing as truth, and now when we try and conduct these experiments in 2019, they're not working. So what is that? Why is that? Why is this replication crisis so prevalent? And maybe it's because just with the passing of time, social psychology actually changes. So what was true 50 years ago may not be true anymore with developments in culture and politics and society. Or maybe it's that the experimenters in that time had a selective bias, so they were only publishing their positive results and not their negative results. Which leads me to another thing which we covered in our research class, which is there is a huge publishing bias for positive results. So if you are conducting a study, you are much more likely to get published in one of the scientific journals if you have positive results. If you have negative results, that may not be published. It's actually much more unlikely to be published, which is unfortunate because negative results can be as informative as positive results, because a negative result will disconfirm your hypothesis. So it's unfortunate that this happens, and it seems to feed the replication crisis. Lastly, before I leave social psychology and move on to the other classes I had, a term that I learned was a confederate. And I mentioned the phrase actors in that bystander effect paradigm, where you have a lot of people around you that are acting. They're in on the experiment. They know that the smoke is going to billow out and they're just ignoring it. Well, they can be called actors, but they can also be called confederates. So that was a new thing for me. I thought it was interesting. Moving on then briefly to the research class, we discussed a whole cohort of things. We were looking at the statistical software package that we're going to be using largely in our course, which is called SPSS. But more interestingly, we discussed the publishing biases, which I referenced in terms of positive results, but also on a more elementary level, we looked at qualitative versus quantitative methods, and also pure research versus applied research. So taking first qualitative and quantitative measures, quantitative usually refers to a large numbers of experimental subjects. So perhaps you do an online survey and you're doing analysis to people's responses to that. That would be an example of quantitative research. Whereas qualitative research is usually more something, it refers to something more like an interview. Like, so if you're conducting an interview with somebody and you're trying to learn more about their subjective experience, that would be a qualitative interview. So quantitative research is typically objective and qualitative research is typically subjective, and we can often blend these two research approaches together. And it's not that one is more important or less important than the other. They're both incredibly important, and I'm going to be likely conducting qualitative and quantitative research in my research project, and I'm certainly going to be looking at a whole cohort of qualitative and quantitative research between case studies, which would be qualitative, and then different meta-analyses, which would be quantitative. Those are kind of the two ends of the spectrum. I mentioned pure research and applied research. Pure research is research basically for the sake of it, for the sake of advancing human knowledge. But applied research is conducting research and discovering information and collecting information for the sole purpose of improving human lives. I thought that was an interesting distinction. Now we're going to look a little bit more at the psychology of health and difficulties and disorders, and we were looking at psychological well-being and how do we define psychological well-being, and there's so many different approaches, and there's actually a lot of disagreement in the field on how to describe psychological well-being. So the different approaches we looked at were family life cycle, psychodynamic, psychosocial, humanistic, attachment theory, and there's so many different researchers that have been involved in all of these different fields. And I think, at least for me, the most interesting ones are kind of the humanistic approach. The most interesting one is the humanistic approach, which involves the research of people like Maslow and Rogers in the last century. And what feeds into this approach is this idea of eudaimonia. So eudaimonia doesn't just focus on the idea of a disorder or the absence of disorders in terms of well-being. It's more about flourishing and more about positive affect in life and how to live a meaningful life. And there's a real intersection here between psychology, neuroscience and philosophy, and even linguistics, because there's so much different language used to describe the same thing and so much disagreement, and a lot of it might be just semantic. So I'd encourage you to look at these different schools of thought and see what do you think is more or less useful. For instance, I'm not personally a large fan of the psychodynamic approach, which was first described by Sigmund Freud. So that discusses a lot of the different developmental stages in terms of fixations, and if we don't work through these fixations, then we might what might result as a pathology. And I just don't think that's relevant to today. But look, that's very, very possible to change as I learn more about it. Something I found interesting was the World Health Organization's definition of health, and part of it refers to an individual realizing his or her own abilities. And I just like to mention a criticism of that, and it might get you thinking as well. I wasn't too convinced by that, because for an individual to realize his or her own abilities, I think that might be limiting. So a lot of us place limits on ourselves and what we can and can't do. And for an individual to realize his or her own ability doesn't describe the effects that other people can have on that individual and how they can elevate them, or perhaps how they can detract from them as well, but more importantly, elevation. So if I was to realize my own abilities without talking to anybody, I mightn't be as informed or mightn't be as helpful as if I talk to people. So there are limitations, and there's lots of different difficulties in terms of defining psychological well-being. It's just not as straightforward as you think it is. And now, talking about cognition. So in cognition, we covered a whole cohort of different things. And what I find very interesting about cognition is that it incorporates so many different areas of human inquiry: philosophy, linguistics, anthropology, psychology, neuroscience, artificial intelligence. There's just so much that informs how we understand cognition. In brief, cognition is the study of thought and mental processes, as well as mental organization. We're going to look at the different philosophies and over time that have shaped how we view cognition. So first of all, we look at materialism, and it's been described brilliantly by so many different people, including Carl Sagan. But given my own bent on materialism, defining it in my own words would be that it means our mind is part of our body. We are one unit. The mind and the body are together. And what I think is the most important part of the mind is the brain. Now, dualistic thinking, or dualism, would push back against that. It sees the mind as something different, which cannot be described by physical processes in the brain and the body. And that philosophy was espoused by René Descartes, who saw human bodies as machines and the mind as something different. The mind that was capable of free will and kind of spontaneous thought, which is totally different to materialism. Materialism is actually around quite a long time. Aspects of it can be discovered in Hippocrates' writings, who looked at the brain as the seat of all thought. He saw it as the most important organ in terms of cognition. And with that in mind, he can be credited with the birth of psychology and neuroscience. Leaving the philosophy aside, I'd like to talk about the Stroop test. The Stroop test I found very, very interesting. I encourage you to Google it. The Stroop test involves coloured words appearing in front of a screen. So for instance, let's say you see the word red, it's coloured red. Green, it's coloured green. Blue, it's coloured blue. And you're asked to say the colour of each of those words as you read them. You're supposed to ignore the meaning of the word, and you're just supposed to say the colour. Now, if that colour is changed to something else, so for instance, if red is, say, green, or if blue is written black, and it becomes more and more difficult, and your reaction times. So this can be a very useful test for many, many different things. So it may or may not take you longer to say the colour longer or shorter, to say the colour of a word which has emotional salience. So to tell me the colour which the word depression is written in on the screen, or which the word anxiety is written on the screen, or which the word death is written on the screen. Leaving the Stroop test aside, we looked at different forms of cognition, different approaches to cognition again. So is cognition a bottom up or a top down phenomenon? Do we view a situation as pure information and work our way logically through it, or is there some interaction between things like memories and our past experiences that affect how we react to certain stimuli? Of course, it seems to be a combination of both, but that's surprisingly only a recent approach or a recent idea when it comes to cognition. In the 70s, the bottom-up approach was seen as gospel, and now that's changed an awful lot. Getting back to this kind of what I'm going to discuss now kind of echoes what I talked about in the replication crisis, which refers to the ecological validity of certain experiments in the lab. So what this means is a lot of research in cognition involves getting test subjects, bringing them into a lab and setting up very specific experimental paradigms, which may give us very true results for that specific paradigm, but that paradigm may not really be found out in the real world. So we have to try and negate the effect of poor ecological validity as best we can by maybe conducting research out in the field or doing observational research. And then lastly, I'm just going to look at the modularity of the brain. So you may have seen people describe the front of the brain as being, where decision making is done. The back of the brain is where visual information is processed, and the cortex across the top part is where we interpret sensory stimuli and where we conduct different motor actions, so where we instruct like our fingers to move or our arms to move or our facial expressions to change an awful lot. Well, I don't have conscious control over that, but that's another story. There are interesting limits that I want to discuss with this. So, for instance, we see with blind people that although they still have this portion of the brain that is typically devoted to visual information, they see that a lot of compensation is made. So, for instance, they might process a lot of aural information in that part of the brain, so hearing information. So they might hear and sense in a different way to sighted people. Now, this isn't always the case, but I just wanted to touch on an interesting limitation. I could go on and on and on about all these different ideas. I just wanted to touch on them. That was week 1 of my psychology masters. Thanks a million for watching and listening. If you liked the video, hit the thumbs up. If you didn't like it, hit the thumbs down. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and check out my Instagram page, where I'll just be giving you some extra information and some interesting pictures about the psychology masters as I progress. Thanks very much.